Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the Treasury International Capital blah, 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 blah. We're going to talk about the Treasury International Capital report, and we're going to talk about three things. I'm talking so fast because just before we went on the air, Jeff was asking, do you think we're going to have time for all three? We've got to make time, folks. Very important things happen, and that's why I'm going to be talking really, really fast in this episode. Jeff, August 19th, 2021, you posted it at Alhambra Investment Partners blog post. You're the head of global research for Alhambra Partners. Here's the title: A TIC trio of more serious deflation potential. Assets rebound. Banks can't borrow T-bills from foreigners. And the China cringe which goes along. We're going to talk about three things, George Gammon. One, the May 2021 big dollar warning. We're going to get an update on that. Two, China. Three, U.S. banks. Woo! Let's go.
You're going to talk fast. I'm going to talk slow because people need to know that we bet before we started, and I bet we would never get all these things in, and that we should only focus on one or two. So I'm going to win the bet by talking much more slowly.
Episode 93B, ladies and gentlemen, is when we talked about the big warning we saw in May, which was foreigners selling what? What were they selling, Jeff?
Primarily treasuries, but a little bit of everything. But, the warning was that there was an overall net negative, more selling than buying, regardless of what the asset classes were, because it used to be very infrequent, and it's become more common nowadays, and more common in the post-2008 era during these periods that we identify with global dollar shortage situations. So to find a negative number in the overall net was a significant enough of finding that led us to say, hey, something's not right here for the month of May, which, that's pretty much consistent with what we already know.
Good news, Jeff. The crisis is canceled. In June, foreigners were once again buying, and we can now move on to part two, right?
Well, yeah, it's a good sign. You don't want to see two negative months in a row, but it's not unusual to see a bounce back one month to the next. So, think about 2013 or 2015, any number of the other times where we saw big minuses in the net 1 month, and then the next month you'd see a bounce back. And it's not really that unusual at all. In fact, it's almost a part of the pattern. So it's really, hey, we saw the negative, now we're on alert. Let's look at other things and see what's going on across the entire system, and not just using the headline TIC numbers.
You called it an omen, a bad omen, that it's just that we had even one negative. And I asked David Parkins to draw up some omens of bad luck. Did you like this one, Jeff?
Yeah, that was good. They're all good from David. It doesn't. His worst thumbnail sketch is probably better than 99% of everybody else's.
He's amazing. I love the look we've got here on Jason with the calendar. Okay, so it was a bad omen. I think
that maybe that's Arthur Burns behind the mask.
Oh, it's just incredible. I love it. I love it. Okay, so now we're moving on to part two, and so we just went from bad omens, so it already gives you the creeps. Quote, I'm reading from you. And now something that always makes me just cringe. So now we're going to be talking about China. I'm going to pull up a graph. Tell us, Jeff.
Yeah, it's the idea is that CNY, the Chinese yuan's exchange rate against the US dollar, you see it go sideways, and that's kind of that's something you never want to see, because that means manipulation. And contrary to mainstream popular belief, manipulation by central banks or other foreign official or any kind of official channels is never a good thing. That's always a response to something that's going on behind the scenes that they can see that we cannot. So in one way, it's one of those omens or warnings that if you start to see a lack of volatility, especially in China's currency, you start to cringe. You start to wonder what's really going on over there. And what's really going on over there, we've been told for the last year and a quarter, almost year and a half, is that the world is flooded with dollars, and those dollars have been flooding into China, and it's been wonderful and great and reflationary and even inflationary. And yet we kind of start to see the cracks emerge, including recently going back to June, where the Chinese currency has sort of gone flat sideways again. And yeah, the that's where we are now. In the most famous or most infamous example of that was in the early part of 2015, I believe March 2015 through August, where increasingly that range got narrowed down to the point where by late June and July 2015, there was basically almost an overt currency peg, which some people in the financial media were celebrating as, the wise Chinese monetary stewards doing what they needed to do, when in fact what they were really doing was becoming more and more desperate as the dollar situation grew further and further against them. And the way that worked out is they were sort of like coiling up a spring, and it only took something relatively innocuous and benign to set it off, and it created all sorts of disruptive conditions, which is, I believe it was August 10th or August 11th of 2015. And suddenly the Chinese currency opened up, down 2% or whatever it was, which shocked the whole world. And then, of course, we had to hear weeks upon weeks about, the Chinese are devaluing their currency to stimulate their exports and all. It's, so that's another reason why we cringe, because not only when you see lack of volatility in the Chinese currency, does that mean intervention? But then we're also going to have to, we also realize that nobody really understands what that intervention is or what its actual purpose is. It's dollar-based, not stimulus.
Now, we're going to tie it into the Treasury International Capital Report, but I was showing your graph of the People's Bank of China balance sheet and their foreign exchange asset holdings, which we've talked about in a previous episode. I've forgotten which one.
Emil, these things are supposed to fit together. They're very different. I mean, these are not the same data series at all, but yet when things are working the way they're supposed to work, you should be able to see consistency between all of these various data points because they're pointing at the same thing, which is the global dollar system. So if we see CNY go up, we think that's reflationary because there's more dollars in the system and more dollars are entering China's hands, then we would expect CNY to go up at the same time. A lot of those dollars end up at the PBOC because of the way the Chinese monetary system is set up and dollarized. So there's already something missing if, CNY is going up, but there's not, the PBOC is not reporting the same on its balance sheet in terms of foreign assets rising. And then the other part of that is TIC, which is the U.S. side looking over there, and we should see the same corroborating thing, which is Chinese, whether it be through Belgium or mainland China holdings, we would expect them to rise as well. We'd expect to see the Chinese, as more dollars are out there in the world, they go into China, which reduces the U.S. dollar exchange value. CNY rises against the U.S. dollar. The dollars end up in the PBOC's hands, which then a lot of those are used to purchase U.S. Treasuries as reserve assets. So all these things we expect to see happen together. And really, go back to 2017's globally synchronized growth reflation number 3. We got the CNY rising. We got a little bit of increase in the PBOC's balance sheet, more so in the TIC data, but that was only the early part of 2017. It kind of got shut off later. And then, of course, now we're seeing this all over again. The CNY since last summer actually has gone way up. It's been very strong, and for a while there, up until January of this year, it seemed like it was on a one-way ticket to the stratosphere. But yet, all that time it was going up. All the time we kept hearing about Jay Powell's flood, digital dollars, the world is awash with liquidity, too much money, bank reserves everywhere. It didn't show up in China in either the PBOC's balance sheet or really in the TIC data either. There was a little bit of a bump up late last year, which was consistent with very modest reflation, but nothing of the sort of the magnitude of CNY's rise, nor the rhetoric in the mainstream media.
That's right, and we're looking at this graph now, and you can see 3 gaps between the currency, the dotted black line, and the cumulative total of the Belgian and Chinese treasury holdings. And we've talked about in a previous episode how we believe that Belgium is not actually the owner of these treasuries, but holding them in custody via Euroclear for the Chinese. That's the scuttlebutt in the macroeconomic grapevine. Is that right, Jeff?
That's the plumbing. Yeah, I don't think there's any. That's not really controversial at all.
It's not. Okay.
No.
And so we see these 3 gaps. We see one in 2015 that resolved itself rapidly. Then we see one in 2017, 2018 that resolved itself over time. Now we see one again. Jeff, what about the notion that the dollars are coming into China, but are bypassing SAFE and the PBOC? And I'm going to read a little comment here from Michael Pettis, who lives in China and comments on these things. And you tell me what you think about it. So he says, it's on Twitter, by the way, August 9th, he posted this in honor of our anniversary there, of the Eurodollar anniversary. According to SAFE, State Administration of Foreign Exchange, China's reserves rose to 3.236 trillion at the end of last month, the highest level since December 2015. This, however, is a little deceptive. Since 2017, the PBOC hasn't directly intervened in the currency, but large Chinese banks have, to the tune of 1 trillion, and presumably those dollars, euros, etc. are also available for use by the PBOC. Counting the two together, China has access to 4.2 trillion, which is more than its previous peak in 2014, or just under 4 trillion. What do you think about that idea?
That's some people have theorized that Chinese banks are either holding them off the books or offshore, or in some way completely invisible to usual channels of data reporting and that kind of a thing. And it's one of those things where you have to shake your head, because it's how do you falsify how do you falsify the theory? Because you're basically saying they must be there because we know they're there, and we've kind of estimated what must be there because we think that's what's there. I don't, in order for that to happen, in order for Chinese to hold dollars offshore, they would have to show up somewhere. They don't just disappear into the ether like they do when the dollar system is contracting. And so we would expect those dollars to show up on TIC or something outside of China that would say, yes, Chinese holdings of U.S. dollar assets have increased materially during this period. Even if it's not PBOC, even if it's not SAFE, there's definitely some kind of origin involved with China. So I don't really believe in the idea that the Chinese banks are holding these dollar inflows off the books, because first of all, why would they want to? And second of all, where are they? It still leaves the question unanswered. If the world is awash in dollars, where are they? They have to show up somewhere, and they simply are not. And that's really the issue here, the fact that we can't seem to find them, which leads us in the direction and toward the conclusion of they aren't there. Again, if you're the Chinese and you want to say things are really good over here in China, why would you not want to say, look at all the dollars we've gotten, look at how the world is going back to normal? Why would you want to hide that? That makes no sense to me whatsoever, except by, well, we don't know what else to say.
He adds, he mentions the CIC, which is their sovereign wealth fund, China Investment Corporation. He says they have at least another 1.1 trillion in foreign exchange reserves there. I don't know if that's showing up on the books or not.
Again, it should show up somewhere outside of China, because, yeah, you can get away with a lot of things in China, especially when, the big Chinese banks are not really private banks. They're essentially state-owned entities, so they're one arm of the government, and they do take direct orders from the PBOC and other, not just the PBOC, but there are other bureaucratic agencies in control. But when we're talking about dollar system and global flows, it may be a dark black hole inside of China, what goes on inside, but there's still somewhat of a trail to follow outside. And TIC data has been a reliable one.
Part 3 now, the third thing that you observed, at least one of the top 3 things. At the beginning of your article, you said there's more, but we're just going to cover 3. Now we're going to talk about Treasury bills. And you remind us in your article all about repo being the lender of last resort, how there's collateral shortages, collateral multipliers, the Treasury is refunding Treasury bills, and then you dive into the graphs. Do you want to give us a refresher on the importance of Treasury bills, or do you think we've covered it previously with previous
I think
episodes?
People might be a little bored with Treasury bills. Yeah, I think we've hit Treasury bills enough.
All right, so let's turn to U.S. banks borrowing collateral in a repo arrangement. What does this graph mean, Jeff?
It means that that collateral is coming from outside the United States. It's being reported as in possession of U.S. banks for who knows, we don't know exactly what specific transactions are involved, except that we do know that they're under resale agreements or repurchase agreements. So some form of repo where collateral is coming into the United States, borrowed by U.S. banks from foreign entities, not just foreign banks, but also foreign non-banks and FOIs, which are foreign central banks and foreign governments. And already, people, what do you mean? U.S. banks are borrowing treasury bills from foreign governments? Yeah, that's kind of what we're saying here. They're not just borrowing treasury bills. They're borrowing all sorts of short-term securities, which is what TIC keeps track of. And they're also borrowing long-term securities, which we don't have any real idea of that at all.
Short-term securities there. Wait, and so, okay, blah. Do we want to talk about this graph? No, we've already talked about it.
That's that's part of it, which is that, if you go above one, go up one more, there you go. So what we're seeing here in this is a big spike in repo collateral being borrowed from U.S. banks borrowing collateral from outside the United States. Both of those two, banks, is the banking system, the non-banking system, as well as foreign official institutions, which is consistent, if you see throughout the chart, with sort of reflationary periods. So U.S. banks get to really risk-taking, and they're getting their collateral from outside they're getting their collateral in some part from outside the United States, borrowing all sorts of securities. So over the last couple months of 2020, first couple months of 2021, that sort of makes sense, right? Because we saw a reflationary wave kind of sweep up over most of the global financial system. So you would expect to find something similar in repo. So there's an indication here of a large increase in repo expansion. Maybe that's the collateral multiplier, securities being repledged and reused and ending up in U.S. bank hands.
But you're worried because you think that it might be junk bonds, and because there's
so if you go down
short
to this next set of charts, which is a different part of the TIC data, so it's not the same stuff. We're looking at what's reported as being held, or what's reported as being borrowed overall in terms of what asset classes, not necessarily in repo, but just overall. And as you would expect, we know that the Treasury Department is refunding bills, which means they're supplying fewer bills because they're getting ready for the debt ceiling constraint, and they had issued a whole ton of bills last year. So supply of bills is coming down, and as we see in the TIC data, quite naturally, that U.S. banks are borrowing fewer bills overall in terms of collateral coming into the United States, into U.S. bank hands. So if you put that idea together with what we just said on the other side, which was U.S. banks borrowing more collateral in repo overall, but it can't be more in treasury bills, we're kind of left with a bit of a conundrum, to borrow a term. And the collateral conundrum isn't really a collateral conundrum. They're not borrowing as many treasury bills, so it's not like they're getting their hands on treasury bills backing all of this repo activity. What must it be then? Well, I don't know. I can guess. I think we can all reasonably guess what it is, especially then we think about somewhat of the, going back to late 2020, November, December 2020, vaccines, stimulus, all that kind of euphoria. Would it really be controversial or unreasonable to think that some of the collateral that was coming back and being borrowed and being reused and repledged was of the lower quality variety? I think that's probably a pretty good guess. And why that's important is that we put these kinds of things together. We've got U.S. banks borrowing more in repo, which kind of tells us maybe something about the overall general tenor, the overall general feelings in the global monetary system. Reflation, a little more risk-taking, maybe a little more risk-taking than anybody appreciated, thinking that, we fixed COVID, the pandemic's over, risks are, there's no more risks anymore, so we can go back to the way it was maybe in 2017, which, as we know, that kind of risk-taking, allowing that amount of junk collateral to infect the collateral system, led inexorably toward the next crisis, which was a collateral bottleneck as all of that junk started to get thrown out of the system. and leading to the scramble for the good stuff, of which there's less of that now. So it's the potential, if that junk did infect the system during that reflationary wave late last year, early this year, then as it gets sort of questionable and then repudiated, what happens then? Well, we know the answer. It's nothing good.
It gets repudiated when there's a downturn, when reflation pauses and starts heading the wrong way.
Which we've seen over and over and over. I mean, 2018, 2014, 2015. I mean, this cycle continues to repeat, and
it's happening right now. Yeah, I would say we're turning. I think I've heard
that's kind of the point here. So now what we're really doing is we're looking back at TIC to tell us, to give us more evidence of what we already think is happening. I mean, look, in real time we have bond yields falling and falling much more quickly over the last couple months, and here we have the TIC data giving us, a lot of the reasons or a lot of the backing behind why that might be. Because if that's true, if our interpretation of the data is true, and look, we're speculating here, let's be honest. We don't have a complete series of data. We don't have specific granular details that we can go to and say, this bank did this with that bank and that other bank, and we know the security that moving around. We don't. We're putting a lot of different pieces together. We think that, having done this for many, many years and, being largely correct about what has been going on, it isn't really too much of an intuitive leap to think that's what has happened. And that would help us explain why this deflationary potential that seems to have come up over the last few months, not necessarily based on COVID, but based on a hell of a lot of other things going back to last year, growth scare, fragility in the collateral system being amplified by what Treasury is doing, being further harmed by what QE buying and stripping longer bonds out of the system. And so any number of things that would give us more detail and more substance behind deflationary potential, which seems to have been much more agreed upon and certain over the last few months.
Yeah, speaking so fast, I can't get my thoughts in order, but having read you for years now, I guess it's almost approaching a decade, I can tell the audience that it's true that when you do speculate, it's well-founded and often very correct. In fact, I don't remember a time when you speculated and didn't come to pass. So I think you're right on here. Jeff, my last thought here is that when we first discussed this issue of rehypothecation, repledging, and reusing, I asked David to illustrate Dolly the sheep when they cloned it, right? Scientists clone and duplicate. What do bankers do? They set up some mirrors and they say, here you go, you can buy this sheep in the mirror. It's just the same sheep. But you know what, Jeff? Having listened to you now and read your article, I think if I asked David to do this again, what I would show is that in the reflections, it's some sort of scraggly sheep, right? It's the junk bond version. It's like
the black sheep.
Yes.
Yes.
It's not even the same sheep now. We're going down in quality. All right. Well,
that's, yes, again, we're speculating, but we think it's a reasonable hypothesis, and we'll see how it shakes out. But I think one of the important reasons why there's been so much demand for T-bills, especially since mid-March, is that the idea that, if we really did allow junk to infect the system again, going too far in our euphoria over vaccines and stimulus and everything else late last year, we know how this ends. It ends with everybody scrambling for Treasury bills and the best quality collateral. So maybe I better get my hands on some, and even hoard some ahead of time, because as the world starts to reject the idea that we're in some robust recovery period, and we start to think about downside risks emerging again across the entire global economy, we get out of this inflation hysteria and start to look at things more rationally, more realistically. Then it makes sense. All of this stuff really does start to make deflationary potential, fragility, and everything else.
I think we're there, Jeff. People that have been correctly identifying inflections in the economy for years now are in agreement. I'm thinking of several of them in my mind right now. They're in agreement. They're seeing things turn right now, and they predicted that they would turn at the beginning of the year, and they are turning. So we'll see what the rest of the year brings. What do the people think, though? That's the question. And yes, I'm going to include German financiers under that broad category of people. We're going to talk about that in part 3. We're going to go over some surveys from Germany, the United States, which had some volatile, big changes, and then as well from the British and Japanese, who are very calm people. They didn't have very big changes, but they've got some important notes that we should go over as well. That's in part 3.